These recipes fed entire nations, long before grocery stores existed. Rooted in tradition and survival, these Native American dinners carry centuries of flavor, wisdom, and resilience. Once you taste them, you'll wonder why no one ever told you sooner. Native American preparations of stuffed roast duck usually included some common themes like wild rice, corn and beans, acorns, and nuts, but it varied region by region. What really makes this such a standout recipe for dinners is that it is quite literally an entire stuffed duck. This is also something you need such as minimal appliances for making. It can be its own little day too. So, if you're feeling like calling a friend over and brushing up your cooking skills over the weekend, this might be a good idea. The stuffing is also not something you need to worry about too much because it's not that hard to make. In California and the Southwest, ground acorns and pine nuts had a long tradition of being thickened into stuffing, and this was usually for pies, but the Native Americans thought it was better with ducks. The use of berries and fruits is definitely something I'm not used to, though, and I don't think a lot of people are. Many tribes like the Cherokee and Lenape would use dried cranberries and choke cherries in a fair amount of recipes, but in terms of stuffed duck, it was always used to add a bit of an extra sweetness to it. I think the most difficult part of this might be just managing the bird, because Native Americans would roast the duck whole. This is obviously something we aren't really used to, but if you really want to get authentic with it, you should try cooking it over an open fire. This ensured a lot more even cooking, and the meat would get really tender on the inside, besides just having a slightly smokier flavor. And that's never a bad thing. Clay-baked fish is also something that's a bit unconventional because it doesn't really match up with anything we use today. It's a traditional cooking method that was used by several Native American tribes spread across the northern regions. A lot of places in North America were rich sources of fish, like the Great Lakes and the Pacific Northwest. Back then, preserving moisture was its own separate issue and struggle, and this was a particularly widespread way of doing that. This method would help the fish retain most of its moisture while also sealing in all kinds of natural flavors, and the end result was a much more exciting dish. Now, this works with most kinds of fish, so it's not like there's some strict preference. You should just roll with what you like. If you want to be historically accurate, then the Chinook and Haida tribes were pretty fond of using salmon. Some tribes also used trout or catfish, but the idea was to prepare the entire fish while also leaving the scales intact. Why would they do this? It was all to help the fish be baked properly. You didn't want anything messing up the meat on the inside. Now, some tribes were also fond of stuffing their fish, but if that's a little much, you don't have to go the extra mile. I think this one might actually work better as a cool history fact, instead of a Saturday dinner you're investing in. But hey, trying new things is cool too. There's definitely nothing as new as a roasted prickly pear cactus for dinner, but to us, it's just an out-of-the-box idea. To them, it was a pretty standard dinner. In arid regions like the Southwest, where cactus growth was always something you would expect, both the pads and the fruit were always eaten. However, cactus on its own isn't exactly the most palatable thing, so roasting it would really help with that. They had a whole specific preparation process for the cactus too. The pads would be harvested when they were young and tender, and before that, they also become very full of fiber. This was good back then because it meant they could be full for a lot longer, and a lot of food and meal plans were designed for sustainability rather than just for the thrill of it. Still, removing the glochids, otherwise known as the spines of the cactus, was as painful as you could imagine. They had tricks for making it quicker, but it was a pain. Native Americans would usually burn off the spines over open flames, or they would scrape them off or cut them with knives. They would also boil them sometimes to loosen the spines. It's definitely one recipe that's really out there, right? Also, interestingly enough, the cacti had a lot of medicinal benefits, like an incredible amount of fiber, a lot of vitamin C, and intense hydration. Venison is one of the most common meats throughout all of history, so it's no surprise that the Native Americans have their own nutty take on it as well. In forests and grasslands, deer would usually thrive a lot more than what we're used to. There used to be, massive packs of them roaming around everywhere. Before the 20th century, also, the American chestnut tree was in its golden years. It was devastated later by regional hazards and blight. Chestnuts were something that were available all over eastern woodlands, so it was very easy to forage them and gather them for emergency situations. Venison was always a staple meat for all kinds of tribes, especially the Cherokee, Shawnee, and Algonquians. Deer was something that was respected by tribes for how much the animal would take care of them. It would give them hides for clothing, the sinew was used for tools, and the bones were used in medicinal broths and kept for trading or for hunting tools. The meat was also very flavorful and important for making pemmican, which was a superfood essential to the Native Americans. Venison was usually cut into cubes and put into a broth with roasted and peeled chestnuts. They would be fond of using Jerusalem artichokes, squash, and wild onions as well, so stock up on your root vegetables before trying this. Corn husk-wrapped tamales have incredibly deep roots in a lot of Mesoamerican cultures. I know you might not really associate them with a lot of different ethnic groups, but it's genuinely something a lot of them have used throughout their history. There were specific tribes like the Pueblo and Hopi that had very agricultural lifestyles, and the Pueblo even had trade and cultural connections with Mesoamerican civilizations. They would share their knowledge with Mexican cultures, and in return, the Mexicans would share theirs. And that's how Native American tribes first became familiar with the idea of tamales. They were already very used to working with dried corn kernels and grounding them into masa. Also, these are a lot different from the typical tamales you might be used to because they usually rely on bison, venison, and rabbit. And each of those has its unique world of flavor different from the chicken and beef we're so used to on the corners of our streets. If you're looking for a fresh spin, try to hit up an authentic Native American joint or work with some venison or rabbit at home. You might be pretty surprised. Hogging an entire hog for yourself was a great hobby for Native Americans. Wild boar roasts were a pretty common activity for Native Americans, but it wasn't something that they came up with. This was actually something they took from the Europeans for once. It was brought over to America by European explorers active during the 16th century. They brought it over in the Southwest, but native species began to spread over to the Southeast after continuous hunting. Tribes like the Creek and Seminole eventually adapted and began to incorporate boris into their diets as well, using their own traditional methods like roasting and pit cooking. The wild boars were really tough to hunt though, but they got pretty good at hunting them down too because of their experience with bows and spears. Some cool military facts. Now, they wouldn't eat the boars as soon as they got them. These were actually mostly preserved for the winter because of the massive amounts of meat they would give. Acorn squash was an incredibly popular cultivated vegetable among many different kinds of tribes. Squash in itself is something the Native Americans experimented with a fair amount. All of that effort eventually brought about the Three Sisters agricultural method, which was basically just growing crops of corn, beans, and squash together. The way they grew helped the other plants grow, so they were always grown together because the end result was more fantastic than if they were grown individually. Sweetening squash with maple syrup was also something that was popular among tribes who were centered around maple syrups, and I don't know if you know this, but tapping into maple trees for the syrup was a very common practice of the Native American peoples. They were arguably better at it than anyone else too, especially because of how much they valued maple syrup as a natural sweetener. Some tribes genuinely loved to have it without the syrup though. They would slice it and dry the squash in the sun for long-term storage. Gooseberry and elk were one of the most prized dishes that Native Americans would make regularly. This was because elk was one of the most treasured animals they had. In the Rocky Mountains, the Pacific Northwest, and the Great Plains, all sorts of tribes were known for how much they prioritized elk usage. This is because elk was something that was beneficial overall, just like deers and bison. The hides wouldn't just be used for clothing. A good quality elk hide, or one that was prized in towns like a white hide, would actually go for a fair amount of resources. They were also something that would provide meat for literally months. Even one elk was a game changer for a tribe going through tough times. They were dried for later use all the time, and the most valuable cuts were always kept for slow roasting so that they could have a great meal out of it. It was preserved for special ceremonies and hunting feasts, which would usually occur during the summer when gooseberries were also in harvest. A roasted elk haunch with some gooseberry sauce was enough food for an entire family or an entire hunting party. So, Imagine what it could do for us today. Before European contact, a lot of Native American tribes had an incredible amount of access to wild tubers and roots. This was really true for potatoes, which had been domesticated in South America. They began to replace some root vegetables as a staple crop because of the sheer amount of utility. I mean, that's a cultural fact that holds true even now. Who can really deny the worth of a potato? Some days, it feels like it's worth more than all the designers in your wardrobe. Native Americans also had an incredibly interesting way of preparing these potatoes. Frying them in bear fat is definitely something I haven't really thought of before. But then again, these people used to hunt bears semi-regularly, so I think we're on pretty different ends of the spectrum. The potatoes would be sliced and fried in bear fat on a flat stone over an open fire, and it would actually make for some extremely rich and crispy potatoes. Napolles and beans were staple foods for so many indigenous peoples. It's a bit surprising this recipe isn't a bit more well-known. Most of the more popular tribes like the Navajo and the Apache were regular consumers of this. In desert areas, prickly pear cactuses were one of the most valued plants because of their versatility, and a big part of that was the reasons we went over earlier when we talked about roasted cacti. Young cactus pads were usually preferred because they were a lot more rich in water content. The beans were a longer process though, and they're just as annoying today as they used to be back then. You had to really soak them thoroughly overnight. Now, once the nopales were cooked, they would be mixed with beans and simmered for even longer, so that the flavor would genuinely mesh well. Some tribes would add wild onions, mesquite pods, and chili peppers for a more well-rounded flavor profile. It was actually quite an amazing little dish. Manuman pilaf is something that's actually a traditional Native American dish centered entirely around wild rice. I know a lot of us are some genuine fans of rice, so for you guys, this will be a good one. It's something that's great as a summer or early fall dish, and it's also pretty healthy. The nutty and earthy flavor unique to wild rice is what really makes this dish stand out. It gives you a way stronger flavor than brown or white rice. It's also a lot more firm and chewy, which is great for people who don't really like their rice on the mushy side. If you parch it with fire, you can even impart a smoky undertone to it. All you need are some walnuts, maple syrup, and cranberries, and you're good to go. Wild rice is still something you can easily get from any local grocery store. Once you have everything you need, you rinse the wild rice, simmer it until it's tender, drain all the excess water, add any flavorings, and then serve it as warm as you can. This is a dish that's considered sacred in the culture of some tribes, particularly the Anishinaabe culture. It's also a great source of protein if you aren't feeling like meat this week. Buffalo and hominy soup is a bit of a unique one. I know that hominy is still something a lot of people prefer, definitely some UNCs and boomers, but also some people who just like retro, vintage, or cultural food. Buffalo meat is a bit harder to get than wild rice though, and depending on where you live, this might not be a dish you're able to recreate, but I digress. You brown the buffalo meat in a pretty large pot, simmer the broth, add the hominy and seasonings, and just stir. Then you taste, test, and serve. It's a pretty easy recipe considering that the rest of the stuff on here does take some technical cooking skill, especially when it comes to the prep work. If you do decide to recreate this, you should honestly aim for making a winter dish out of it. That's how it was historically eaten back in the day for the Native American peoples as well, and that's because bison meat was really good at keeping you warm. Plus, this is just one of those soups that brings life back into you. Beaver tail soup was also a very prized dish, and beavers were actually a favorite among Native Americans. I don't know how you feel about them, but personally, I think the little runts are really entertaining. What I did not know is that they are actually also really good for energy because they're so full of fat. Lots of tribes like the Iroquois and Blackfoot would prepare beaver tail soup specifically as a winter-only dish because of how well it would sustain most of the tribes. A single serving of soup could fill a person up with enough energy to last through a tough winter day, and it could be preserved for later. Mixing in different kinds of foraged materials and ingredients would only bulk the soup up a lot more and do wonders for its nutritional content. Herbs like juniper and sage were amazing final touches, and the end product was something that really revitalized a person. though the preparation process is definitely something to keep in mind. I'm also not entirely sure where you could get beaver tail from. If you really want to do something for a big flat-out feast, though, there's just nothing better than some Native American-style spit-roasted turkey. Turkey was a major source of protein and food for indigenous peoples in the eastern woodlands. They had been used to preparing and handling turkey for generations. They even had the cleaning process down to a science. Also, the feathers of the bird were used for clothing, for arrows, so that they would fly faster, and for rituals. I think they had some pretty good Thanksgiving ideas a long while before it even became a thing. If you wanted to recreate this today, you should ideally use a wild turkey, but even a domestic one works well. Also, smoked paprika and wild onions, plus the sage and thyme. I also suggest keeping it authentic and going with some bear fat or walnut oil if you can. You would need to set up a rotisserie spit over an open fire if you can. The end result is this deeply flavorful turkey that's got this wonderfully crispy exterior on the outside, but a smoky taste and tender feel on the inside. It's really just a delight for any kind of big gathering or party, and it's not a dish you want to be missing out on. Chili-spiced pumpkin mash is a dish that does wonders with some flavors you would have never imagined working together. The sweetness of pumpkin is something we normally would never associate with the intense tang of chili spices, but hey, this savory and sweet mash is here to break stereotypes and expand horizons. Pumpkin was a major crop for indigenous peoples across all kinds of regions in America, both the northern and southern parts. It was something people loved for the immense amount of nutrition it had. Indigenous peoples of the Northeast and Great Lakes regions would grow several different versions of squash, and some of these would include pumpkins. It was definitely a very fall-only item, and to be honest, it went along with the autumn vibes very well. People loved the contrast of this dish. The natural sweetness of the pumpkin balanced out very well from the heat of the chili peppers, and it made a very comforting dish. The texture of the mashed pumpkin was something that contrasted with the smoky notes of the chili, and that led to it becoming a very well-rounded flavor profile. It was like a party in your mouth. This is a recipe that's perfect for all the different kinds of vegetarian fans out there. If corn and tomatoes sound like your cup of tea, then sun-dried tomato and corn pudding is something that's going to rock your entire world. Native Americans had a fun little way of making this recipe too. Indigenous peoples would grind corn using all kinds of different tools, such as a handheld grinding tool or a stone mortar and pestle. This was all done so that it would achieve an incredibly coarse texture in the end, and then herbs were added. The herbs were pretty much the usual ones you've seen, but any peppers from trading were also commonly added onto this. As far as typical Native American flavors go, this is definitely a little bit unconventional. The pudding was also something that was a unique texture. It was also something that was cooked on a cast iron skillet more than it was made over an open fire. The slow cooking was really essential for people because the flavors would seal themselves in completely, giving you the savoriness and tang of the sun-dried tomatoes with the creamy texture and sweetness of corn. When you hear about sweet potatoes, your mind immediately goes to them. They're just that good. When you hear about ash-baked sweet potatoes, your mind immediately raises several question marks, because why is there ash on my food? Yet this was a common practice done by Native American peoples back in the day. It was very regular for sweet potatoes to be placed directly in the embers of an open fire or to be layered with hot ash to protect them from the flame. Otherwise, you would risk burning those potatoes. And wastage was a very different concept back then to what it is now. Nowadays, a little kitchen-related oopsie-daisy isn't anything to worry about. It happens, we just hold space for it. Back then, it was actually a deal, like you really didn't want to be wasting food like that. Depending on the size of the sweet potatoes, they would usually bake for an hour or 45 minutes, and the heat from the embers and ash would help to soften the potatoes. The best part was that they would also get a ridiculously nice smoky texture and flavor from it too. Sweet potatoes were something the Cherokee and Creek tribes got really good at, and it was for this exact recipe. Wild mushroom ragu is a rich and savory dish that really shows you just how much natural goodness there is in the forest. It draws on the fact that wild mushrooms were an incredibly abundant resource back then in the woodlands of North America. The preparation of this dish was something that reflected the knowledge of indigenous peoples as well, because it just showed how much they truly knew about the land they were living in. Their ability to forage ingredients that could work both as daily sustenance and a big feast was also something impressive. Long story short, these people were adaptable like nothing else. The mushrooms would be cleaned, chopped, and sliced, and wild herbs would be used to make ragu. It would add an aromatic and herbal layer to the dish that really helped when you would eventually get to the earthy mushroom flavor, combined with the chewy texture. All in all, for people who can't deny a good mushroom, this is a dish worth recreating in its entirety. If there's one dish that captures Native American cuisine, it's roasted duck with wild plum sauce. Traditionally, indigenous tribes across North America hunted wild game like duck, which provided a rich source of protein and fat, especially crucial during colder months. Ducks were slow roasted over open flames, allowing the skin to crisp up beautifully while keeping the meat juicy and tender. Now, let's talk about the real star, which was the wild plum sauce. Wild plums were treasured by native peoples, especially in the Great Plains and Midwest regions. Tart and naturally sweet, these little fruits were foraged in late summer and used to make everything from preserves to savory sauces. When simmered down into a reduction with a hint of honey, wild herbs, and sometimes even a dash of cedar or juniper for that forestry punch, the sauce turns into a tangy, slightly sweet glaze that perfectly complements the roasted duck. It's a reminder of how native cuisine masterfully used local, seasonal ingredients to create meals that were not only nourishing, but also deeply satisfying. Trust me, once you try it, you'll wonder how you ever lived without it. Hickory smoked trout is a dish that's both traditional and economical. This recipe was built to both maximize preservation and flavor. The techniques that were developed by the indigenous peoples came in very handy with all sorts of recipes, but the effect was very clear here. Smoking fish was an extremely standard way of reducing spoilage and wastage. Plus, the rich, smoky flavor of hickory already synchronized very well with the technique of smoking fish. That is to say, it all worked together and came together brilliantly. Trout was a very common seafood for people, and depending on the species, you would get an entirely different flavor profile too. Though I always thought that rainbow trout would be better, people were also known to use brook trout for smoking. If you don't have access to either, even freshwater fish is a great alternative. Just make sure to clean and gut whatever you get. Interestingly enough, Native American recipes would not require deboning, but if that's something you want to go ahead with, feel free to do so and recreate this in your own way. What really matters here is whether or not you smoke the trout over a consistently low temperature, because that's kind of the entire key to sealing all those flavors in. The trout is a delicate fish, and the exact kind of flavor and texture the Native Americans would impart to it was something that was only possible thanks to a lot of attention to detail. When you do try to recreate this, make sure you're paying that much attention. Corn and bean. Succotash is a really traditional dish with roots that extend very far into Native American cuisine, particularly among tribes that come from areas like the Great Lakes, eastern woodlands, and the northeastern parts of our country. The combination of corn and beans isn't something groundbreaking. It's something that's been popular in almost every kind of culture across the world. It's also something that is really valued in Native American culture. The combination of corn with squash is known as the Three Sisters method, like we previously mentioned. It's actually a really good technique because the corn you get from this is a lot sweeter, softer, and juicier. Think of it like teamwork, but for plants. Succotash itself is just a dish that takes those essential ingredients, like corn and beans, and mixes them with the kinds of vegetables, herbs, and seasonings that are available on hand. As a result, each tribe had their own regional spin on succotash, and wherever you would go, you would find a different variation. The dish was something that almost always consisted of dried corn and dried beans, though, but some tribes skipped the part where they dried beans, because then you wouldn't have to further soak them to soften them up. I like procrastinating too, so that's definitely a trick I'll keep in mind. Once it's done, it's one of the most refreshing meals you can ever have. Blackberry glazed venison is a dish that takes the rich and earthy flavor of venison and combines it with the tart sweetness that you so genuinely love about blackberries. It creates this savory and sweet experience that's entirely unique because, quite honestly, while we do have a lot of savory and sweet, we just don't have anything like this. It's a great example of how Native American cuisine often combines wild game with different kinds of fresh foraged fruits and berries and makes dazzling, unique combinations with them. This is all because, unlike us, Native Americans had an incredibly deep understanding and awareness of their environment. And that's the first step in taking advantage of anything, becoming aware of it. The use of blackberries as a glaze or a sauce for wild game, for example, was something that indigenous cultures came up with after several rounds of trial and error. Blackberries were something they learned to use over time, and that's one thing I really like about Native American recipes. You can tell that the people who made them were very open to exploring potential possibilities. I think as a country, we were only that experimentative in the 60s or 50s. Anyway, back to actual vintage times. Venison was a primary source of protein for so many tribes that it was honestly their go-to. The abundant wildlife in several regions meant that a hunting-based lifestyle was pretty natural. They were also very good at butchering the deer, and they would cut it up in specific ways using the loin, shoulder, and back strap because of how tender and flavorful they were. Would you ever try this? Steamed maple pudding is a really delicious and comforting dessert. It's something that takes the warm allure of maple syrup, something we've all become so fond of, and the beautiful, comforting texture of a steamed pudding. What do you get in the end? One of the best kinds of comfort foods you can imagine, with a very maple-oriented twist. This is the perfect autumn dessert, the perfect midday brunch recipe, or just a wonderful thing to bring to a potluck with your friends. Either way, if you want all eyes on you and a round of applause, this is what you should be bringing. In traditional Native American cooking too, this is pretty much the reception the dish had. Maple sap was something they prioritized so much in most of their cooking, and it was a dish that wasn't good for just fall, but also for early spring when the maple collecting would begin. In early spring, indigenous peoples would tap sugar maple trees regularly, and then they would haul it back to their tribes and camps. There, they would begin to boil the sap down into a syrup or sugar and use it throughout the year. The syrup had a really rich and caramel-like flavor, and it had a lot of woodiness to it as well. Steamed maple pudding is a delicious dish that embodies how resourceful Native American cooking can be. And in times like today, where food and groceries are even higher than rent, it's a trait we should embody as religiously as we can, to be honest. Also, wouldn't you want to make this for someone special? Acorn dumplings are a traditional Native American dish, about as traditional as it gets, really. This is a recipe that shows you just how reliant on corn these people really were, and how, especially in the Northeast and California regions, acorns were just about the lifeblood of people. Oak trees were something that Native Americans valued for several different reasons, and if this was a video about their gardening practices, I'd love to tell you more about that. But back to how you make dumplings out of acorns. Right, so once the harvesting in the fall is done, they were selected very meticulously. You wanted to pick up the absolute ripest acorns possible, and once they were picked, the bitter tannins that were present in all of them had to be leached out. This is something you should too. Squash blossom fritters are a really delightful dish that combine the flavor of squash blossoms with the incredible texture and flavor of fried batter. These fritters were something that had deep roots in Native American cuisine, and they were particularly beloved among tribes in the Southwest and Mesoamerican regions, where squash was not only a staple crop, but something of a winter preference as well. Squash blossoms were edible flowers that would bloom from the squash plant, and the fritters were a concept that was present in indigenous food to begin with. However, they didn't start using flour for battering until they saw Europeans doing it. Squash blossoms were something that also looked really pretty, so this is definitely one of those dishes that has a lot of presentation and visual flair to it too. It's a light and flavorful recipe, and it's one of the best things to make if you want to show off your cooking skills with a more subtle dish. This brings all the Native American dinners that I think you should try to an end. Comment below which dish you're cooking up next, and don't forget to like and subscribe.